In 1894, in the town of Pullman, Illinois, something unusual happened. George Pullman had built the perfect company town. Clean streets, manicured lawns, houses for workers, schools for their children, a library, a church, everything a worker could need. Owned by the company. Workers earned wages. Then they paid those wages back. Rent to the company. Groceries from the company store. Utilities to the company. At the end of each month, many workers opened their pay envelopes to find a slip of paper that read $0. They had worked, they had earned, and they had nothing. When the panic of 1893 hit, Pullman cut wages by 28%. But he didn't cut rent, he didn't cut prices at the company store. Workers now owed more than they earned. They couldn't leave. They were in debt to the company. They couldn't stay. They were starving. The strike that followed was crushed by federal troops. 13 workers died. The leader, Eugene Debs, was imprisoned. And George Pullman, he kept collecting rent. That was 130 years ago. The company town is gone, but the model survived. Today, 63% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. They work. They earn. And at the end of each month, after rent, after groceries, after debt payments, they have nothing. The company town didn't disappear. It expanded. It became the entire economy. The question is, do you even know you're living in one? On June 22nd, 1944, President Franklin Roosevelt signed a piece of legislation that would reshape American society. The Servicemen is Readjustment Act, known as the GI Bill, promised returning soldiers something unprecedented. A pathway to the middle class. Free college education, low-interest home loans, unemployment benefits. For the first time in history, a government was offering working men not just survival, but prosperity, and it worked spectacularly. In the 2 decades following World War II, American workers experienced something that had never happened before and has never happened since. Wages rose in lockstep with productivity. When a factory produced more, the workers who ran those machines earned more. A single income could buy a house, a car, a vacation, and still put money in the bank. A high school graduate with a factory job could send his children to college. The American dream wasn't mythology. It was measurable. Between 1948 and 1973, productivity in the United States rose by 96.7%. Worker compensation rose by 91.3%, nearly perfect alignment. When the economy grew, workers captured that growth. This was the implicit contract. Work hard and you will get ahead. Then something broke. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on television and announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold. The Bretton Woods system, which had anchored global currencies to the dollar and the dollar to gold, was dead. Nixon called it temporary. It became permanent. What followed was the most significant economic shift of the 20th century, and almost no one understood what was happening. Freed from the gold anchor, the Federal Reserve could now create money without limit. And they did. The money supply, which had grown slowly for decades, began expanding rapidly. Between 1971 and 1980, the M2 money supply doubled. Prices rose. Inflation, which had averaged 2.5% in the 1960s, spiked to 13.5% by 1980. But here's what the textbooks don't emphasize. Wages didn't keep pace. From 1973 onward, the link between productivity and compensation shattered. Productivity continued climbing, up 64.6% between 1979 and 2019. But hourly compensation for typical workers? Up only 17.3%. The gap between what workers produced and what they were paid widened every single year. Where did that missing 47.3% go? It went up. Corporate profits rose, executive compensation exploded, stock prices soared, the wealth that workers created flowed not into their paychecks, but into the portfolios of those who owned capital. The implicit contract, work hard and you will get ahead, was quietly rewritten. The new contract read, work hard and someone else will get ahead. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a natural economic phenomenon. It was a choice, embedded in policy after policy, decade after decade. Consider what changed after 1971. Labor unions, which had represented 27% of American workers in 1973, were systematically weakened. By 2019, only 10.3% of workers were unionized. Minimum wage, which had tracked productivity growth, was frozen for years at a time. Adjusted for inflation, the federal minimum wage today buys less than it did in 1968. Tax rates on the highest earners, which had exceeded 90% in the 1950s, were slashed to 37%. Capital gains, income from owning things, it was taxed at lower rates than income from working. Each policy shift moved money in the same direction, away from labor toward capital. But the genius of the system was that it didn't feel like theft. It felt like personal failure. When your grandfather bought a house in 1955, he didn't think he was living in an exceptional moment. He thought he was doing what everyone did. When your father struggled to afford a house in 1985, he blamed himself for not working hard enough. When you, in 2024, cannot imagine ever owning a home, you blame your avocado toast, your coffee habit, your failure to budget properly. The system taught you to look inward for the problem. It never taught you to look at the chart, showing productivity and wages diverging like splitting highways. This pattern is not new. It is, in fact, ancient. In the Roman Republic, citizens were promised grain. The annona, the grain dole, began as a subsidy, then became a right. By the time of Augustus, over 200,000 Roman citizens received free grain. They were fed. They were housed in insulae, cramped apartment blocks. They were entertained with games, and they were controlled. The grain dole was not generosity, it was management. A population dependent on state distribution does not revolt. It waits in line. The Roman citizen who once owned a farm, who once fed himself, became a client of the state. His independence was traded for survival. The mechanism was simple. Make people dependent, and they become predictable. In England, between 1750 and 1860, something similar occurred through the Enclosure Acts. For centuries, English peasants had survived through access to common land, shared pastures, forests, and fields where they could graze animals, gather firewood, and grow food. They were poor, but they were independent. They could feed themselves. The Enclosure Acts privatized those commons. Land that had belonged to everyone now belonged to someone. Over 4,000 Acts of Parliament transferred approximately 6.8 million acres from common use to private ownership. Peasants who had once sustained themselves were now landless. They had two choices: work for wages in the new factories or starve. This was not progress. It was dispossession disguised as progress. The factories needed workers, but not independent workers who might leave when conditions were bad. They needed desperate workers, workers who had no alternative, workers who would accept whatever wages were offered because the alternative was death. The Enclosure Acts created the modern labor force by destroying the alternative to wage labor. Do you see the pattern? Rome fed its citizens to control them. England dispossessed its peasants to coerce them. America promised prosperity, then quietly severed the link between work and reward. Different mechanisms, identical outcomes, populations that must work for wages, that cannot survive outside the wage system, that are trapped. The paycheck is not freedom. It is the modern equivalent of the Roman grain dole. It is distributed at the pleasure of employers. It can be raised or lowered, given or taken. And the worker who owns no land, who has no commons, who cannot feed himself, must accept whatever is offered. Your great-grandfather might have had a garden. Your grandfather might have known how to fix his own car. Your father might have had a pension. What do you have? A dependency. You depend on your employer for income. You depend on the grocery store for food. You depend on the bank for housing. You depend on the stock market for retirement. Every link in the chain of your survival runs through institutions you do not control. This is not an unfortunate side effect of modern life. It is the design. When the productivity wage gap opened in 1973, it should have been a national emergency. It should have triggered reforms, investigations, protests. Instead, it was explained away. Globalization, technology, skills gaps. The explanations were always external, always abstract, never pointing at the specific policies and decisions that created the gap. Because if Americans understood that the gap was a choice, that their stagnant wages were the direct result of decisions made by specific people in specific institutions, they might demand those decisions be reversed. Better to let them blame themselves. Better to let them believe that harder work will solve the problem. Better to let them chase a dream that was quietly discontinued 50 years ago. The American dream is still advertised. It just no longer ships. But here's what makes the modern system even more effective than Rome's grain dole or England's enclosures. The trap is not just about wages. The paycheck is only half the mechanism. The other half is what happens to your money before you even see it, and who benefits when it finally reaches you. There is a grave in Paris that almost no one visits. It belongs to a man named Richard Cantillon, an Irish-French economist who was murdered in 1734, likely by a disgruntled former cook, who then burned down his house to cover the crime. Cantillon was 54 years old. He had made a fortune, lost friends to financial ruin, and written a single book that would not be published until 2 decades after his death. That book contained a discovery so dangerous that modern economists still try to ignore it. Cantillon observed something simple. When new money enters an economy, it does not spread evenly. It does not fall like rain, touching everyone equally. It flows like a river, and those standing closest to the source get wet first. By the time the water reaches the people downstream, the landscape has already changed. This is now called the Cantillon effect, and it explains why you feel poorer every year, even when the government says the economy is growing. Cantillon understood this because he had witnessed it firsthand. In 1716, a Scottish gambler and financial theorist named John Law convinced the French regent to let him open a bank. Law had a revolutionary idea. Money did not need to be gold or silver. It could be paper, backed by nothing but confidence. The government could print as much as it needed. The regent, desperate to pay France's crushing war debts, agreed. Law's Banque Générale began issuing paper notes. Then Law created the Mississippi Company, which promised investors wealth from France's Louisiana territory. He merged the bank and the company, creating a financial machine that issued stock and printed money simultaneously. Stock prices soared. In 1719, shares of the Mississippi Company rose from 500 livres to over 10,000 livres. Fortunes were made in weeks. But Cantillon noticed something the euphoric investors missed. The new money, the paper notes flooding Paris, did not reach everyone at the same time. Law's bank issued notes to the government, which paid its creditors. Those creditors spent the money, paying their suppliers. The suppliers paid their workers. At each step, the money changed hands, but at each step, prices rose. The people who received the money first, the government's direct creditors, the insiders, the early investors, spent it when prices were still low. They bought real assets, land, gold, art, businesses. By the time the money reached the shopkeepers, the laborers, the farmers, prices had already risen to absorb the new money. The late receivers paid more for everything but earned the same. Cantillon saw this clearly. Money creation is a transfer of wealth, not from rich to poor, from late receivers to early receivers, from outsiders to insiders, from you to them. He sold his Mississippi Company shares near the peak. He converted his paper livres to gold. He watched as the bubble collapsed in 1720. As the paper money became worthless, as the people who had trusted John Law lost everything, Cantillon walked away rich. Most of France walked away ruined. The same mechanism operates today, only the scale has changed. In September 2008, the global financial system nearly collapsed. Lehman Brothers failed. Credit markets froze. The Federal Reserve, under Chairman Ben Bernanke, faced a choice: let the system fail or flood it with new money. They chose the flood. Between 2008 and 2014, the Federal Reserve created approximately $3.5 trillion through a process called quantitative easing. They did not print physical bills. They created digital money, entries in a computer, and used it to buy bonds from financial institutions. The money went directly to the largest banks: JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, Citigroup. This was the river's source, and the banks stood directly in it. What did the banks do with this money? They did not lend it to small businesses. They did not invest in factories or infrastructure. They bought assets, stocks, bonds, real estate, art, anything that would hold value. Asset prices began rising immediately. The S&P 500, which had bottomed at 666 in March 2009, began a climb that would eventually exceed 4,000. Housing prices, which had collapsed during the crisis, began recovering in major cities. By 2012, institutional investors were buying entire neighborhoods of foreclosed homes, converting them to rentals. The early receivers, the financial institutions, captured the new money while prices were still low. They bought assets that appreciated as more money entered the system. Now trace the river downstream. The Federal Reserve created money. The banks received it. The banks bought assets. Asset prices rose. Corporations, seeing their stock prices rise, felt wealthy. Some hired workers. Some raised wages. But by the time those wages reached workers, if they reached them at all, prices had already risen. Housing in major cities became unaffordable. A home that cost $200,000 in 2010 cost $450,000 by 2022, rents doubled. A worker who received a 3% annual raise watched housing costs rise 8% annually. They were running on a treadmill that accelerated faster than they could sprint. This is the Cantillon effect in modern form. Between 2009 and 2019, the top 1% of Americans captured 52% of all income growth. The bottom 90% captured less than half. But the statistics are even starker for wealth. The top 10% of Americans own 89% of all stocks. When the Federal Reserve inflates asset prices, the top 10% capture nearly all the benefit. The bottom 50% of Americans own essentially no stocks. They own debt. When asset prices rise, they pay higher rent to landlords whose property is appreciated. They pay higher prices for goods sold by corporations whose stock prices rose. They receive the money last and pay the inflated prices first. This is why your grandparents could buy a house on a single income, and you cannot buy one on two. It is not because you are lazier. It is not because you waste money on luxuries. It is because the money that was supposed to reach you was absorbed before it arrived. In 1720, the people of France did not understand why they suddenly could not afford bread. They blamed the bakers. They blamed the merchants. They rioted in the streets of Paris. They never blamed John Law's money printing because they did not understand the connection. Today, Americans do not understand why housing costs more every year, why groceries drain their paychecks, why they cannot get ahead despite working harder than their parents. They blame themselves. They blame immigrants. They blame the other political party. They almost never blame the Federal Reserve because they do not understand the connection. The Cantillon effect is not taught in schools. It is not discussed on the news. It is the invisible mechanism that transfers wealth from the working class to the asset-owning class, year after year, dollar after dollar. Since 2008, the Federal Reserve has created over $8 trillion. That money flowed first to the largest financial institutions, then to asset owners, then slowly diminished, diluted to workers. By the time it reached you, the river was a trickle. But the flood had already reshaped the landscape. Richard Cantillon was murdered before he could see how his discovery would be used. But if he were alive today, he would recognize the pattern instantly. The money never reaches you. That is not a bug. It is the design. And it is only one part of the trap. Because even the trickle that does reach your paycheck does not stay there for long. In 1955, a Tennessee singer named Merle Travis wrote a song about coal miners. The song was called 16 Tons, and it contained a line that would become one of the most haunting in American music. I owe my soul to the company store. The line was not metaphor, it was documentation. In the coal fields of Appalachia, miners were paid not in dollars but in scrip, company-issued currency that could only be spent at the company store. The store charged inflated prices. A bag of flour that cost 50 cents in town cost $1 at the company store. Rent for company housing was deducted before the miner ever saw his pay. Medical care, tools, even the dynamite used in the mines, all charged to his account. At the end of each pay period, the miner would receive a statement. Wages earned minus deductions. For many, the number was negative. They had worked 2 weeks and now owed more than they had earned. They could not leave. Their debt bound them to the mine. They could not protest. Troublemakers were evicted from company housing and blacklisted from other mines. They could not save. Every dollar they earned flowed back to the company that employed them. This was called debt peonage. It was technically illegal after 1867. It continued in various forms until the 1940s. The company store is gone now. But the mechanism it perfected, using debt to bind workers to the system, has been industrialized, financialized, and deployed at a scale those coal companies could never have imagined. The average American household now carries $154,000 in debt. This includes mortgages, auto loans, student loans, and credit cards. For households with credit card debt, the average balance exceeds $10,000, carried at interest rates averaging 24.7%. Let those numbers settle. A worker carrying $10,000 in credit card debt at 24.7% interest who pays only the minimum will take over 30 years to pay it off and will pay more than $18,000 in interest alone. This is not an accident. This is not financial illiteracy. This is a system designed to ensure that debt compounds faster than wages grow. The mathematics are precise. When you borrow money, you do not simply borrow the principal. You borrow the principal plus interest. That interest must be paid with money that comes from somewhere. If you earn wages, the interest comes from your future labor. You have sold hours of your life, hours you have not yet worked, to the lender. Debt is time travel. It allows you to consume today what you cannot afford until tomorrow. But the exchange rate is brutal. You trade future dollars for present dollars at a steep discount. A dollar borrowed today costs 1.25 tomorrow, $1.50 next year, 3 euro in a decade. The lender is not taking a risk. The lender is purchasing your future at a discount and collecting the premium as interest. This mechanism is ancient. In Rome, it was called nexum. A debtor who could not pay could be bound to his creditor as a laborer. He would work without wages until his debt was cleared. The creditor could chain him. The creditor could sell him. The debtor was not quite a slave. His bondage was theoretically temporary, but the distinction was academic. He worked, he was not paid, he could not leave. Nexum was abolished in 326 BCE, after a debtor named Gaius Publilius was so brutally mistreated that it triggered public outrage. The Romans recognized that debt bondage was incompatible with citizenship. A man who owed his labor to another could not be free. 23 centuries later, Americans have recreated nexum without chains. Consider the student loan system. In 1980, the average cost of a 4-year public university was almost $100 per year. Today, it exceeds $22,000. Total student loan debt in America has surpassed $1.77 trillion, distributed among 43 million borrowers. The average graduate carries $37,000 in debt. Unlike other forms of debt, student loans cannot be discharged in bankruptcy. A provision slipped into the 1998 Higher Education Act and strengthened in 2005 made student loans uniquely inescapable. You can declare bankruptcy and eliminate credit card debt, medical debt, even gambling debt, but student loans follow you to the grave. A 22-year-old graduate enters the workforce already owing $37,000. At average interest rates, the debt will generate over $20,000 in interest over a standard repayment period. The graduate will work for years simply to service this debt before making any progress on the principal. This debt shapes every decision that follows. The graduate cannot take a low-paying job in public service. The debt payments require a higher salary. The graduate cannot start a business. The debt payments require steady income. The graduate cannot take risks. The debt demands consistency. The debt produces workers who are compliant, predictable, and afraid. In medieval Europe, serfs were bound to the land. They could not leave the manor without permission. They owed labor to the lord, a set number of days each year working the lord's fields. In exchange, they were permitted to work their own small plots for survival. The modern worker is not bound to land. The modern worker is bound to debt. They cannot leave their job without risking default. They owe labor to their creditors, a set number of hours each month paying interest. In exchange, they are permitted to keep whatever remains for survival. The mechanism has been inverted, but the function is identical. Debt produces workers who cannot refuse. And here is the darkest part of the engine. When you take on debt, you create an asset. Not for yourself, for the lender. Your mortgage is your liability, but it is the bank's asset. Your student loan is your burden, but it is Sally Mae's revenue stream. Your credit card balance costs you 24.7% per year, and it earns the credit card company 24.7% per year. The $154,000 in debt carried by the average household is not just a liability for that household. It is an asset for the financial system. It pays interest. That interest is collected, packaged, and sold. Your debt becomes a bond. Your interest payments become someone else's income. This is why the system requires you to borrow. Not because it benefits you. The mathematics prove it does not. But because your debt is their asset. Your interest is their income. Your bondage is their business model. The coal miner owed his soul to the company store because the company designed the system that way. You owe your future to the financial system because the financial system designed it that way. 16 tons, and what do you get? Another day, older and deeper in debt. The song was written as a lament. It should have been a warning. But debt alone cannot explain the trap. Because even as the system binds you with debt, it simultaneously extracts from you through another mechanism, one hidden in plain sight, buried in every paycheck, and designed to ensure that work is punished while wealth is rewarded. On October 12, 2011, Warren Buffett sat before a congressional hearing and made a confession that should have ended careers. I paid $6,138,744 in federal income tax last year, Buffett told the lawmakers. This sounded like an enormous sum. It was not. Buffett then explained that this amount represented only 17.4% of his taxable income. His secretary, he noted, paid a higher rate. In fact, every single employee in his office paid a higher percentage of their income in taxes than the third richest man in the world. The room did not erupt in outrage. No one demanded an immediate rewriting of the tax code. The hearing continued. The testimony was reported, discussed briefly, and forgotten. Because Warren Buffett had not revealed a bug in the system, he had described its central feature. The American tax system is designed to extract maximum revenue from people who work while minimizing the burden on people who own. This is not an accident. It is not a loophole that Congress forgot to close. It is architecture built deliberately, reinforced repeatedly, and protected ferociously. To understand how this happened, you must return to 1913. On February 3rd of that year, the 16th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, granting Congress the power to levy income taxes. The amendment was sold to the American public as a way to tax the rich, and initially it did. The first income tax applied only to incomes above $3,000, equivalent to approximately $93,000 today. 99% of Americans paid nothing. The tax was designed to reach the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Morgans, the industrial titans whose wealth had grown obscene during the Gilded Age. For the working man, income tax was irrelevant. He would never earn enough to owe a penny. That promise lasted exactly 5 years. By 1918, with World War I raging, the income tax threshold had dropped dramatically, and rates had soared. The top marginal rate hit 77%. But more importantly, the base had expanded. Millions of Americans who had been promised they would never pay income tax were now paying income tax. The pattern would repeat throughout the 20th century. During World War II, the income tax transformed from a class tax into a mass tax. In 1939, approximately 4 million Americans filed tax returns. By 1945, that number had exploded to 43 million. Withholding, the automatic deduction of taxes from paychecks, was introduced in 1943, making tax collection invisible and unavoidable. The working class, which had been promised that income tax was not their burden, now bore the majority of it. But something else happened during this expansion. As the tax base widened to capture workers, the tax code simultaneously developed an elaborate architecture of exemptions, deductions, and preferential rates, almost all of which benefited capital over labor. The most consequential of these is the distinction between ordinary income and capital gains. Ordinary income is money you earn by working. Your salary, your wages, your hourly rate, all taxed as ordinary income at rates up to 37%. Capital gains are money you earn by owning. When a stock appreciates, when a property increases in value, when an investment pays off, that profit is taxed as capital gains at rates up to 20%. A nurse who earns $80,000 per year pays a marginal rate of 22% on her labor. A hedge fund manager who earns $80 million per year from investment gains pays 20% on that wealth. The nurse works 12-hour shifts. The hedge fund manager watches numbers change on a screen. The nurse pays a higher rate, but even this understates the disparity, because there exists a provision so egregious, so nakedly designed to benefit the wealthy, that it has its own name in tax law: carried interest. Hedge fund and private equity managers do not simply invest their own money. They invest other people's money and take a percentage of the profits, typically 20%. This fee is called carried interest. By any reasonable definition, it is compensation for services rendered. It is payment for work. But the tax code does not treat it as work. It treats carried interest as capital gains. This means that a private equity manager earning $500 million in carried interest pays 20% tax, while a surgeon earning $500,000 in salary pays 37%. The manager earns 1,000 times more and pays nearly half the rate. Congress has been aware of this provision for decades. Multiple bills have been introduced to close the loophole. None have passed. The carried interest provision survives because the people who benefit from it donate generously to the politicians who protect it. Now consider the corporate side of this equation. In 1952, corporate income taxes provided 32.1% of federal revenue. Workers' payroll taxes provided 9.7%. The corporations paid more than 3 times what workers paid. By 2020, corporate taxes provided just 6.6% of federal revenue. Payroll taxes provided 35.7%. The ratio had inverted completely. Workers now pay more than 5 times what corporations pay. This shift did not happen naturally. It was engineered through decades of lobbying, legislation, and elaborate corporate structures designed to minimize tax obligations. Consider the double Irish with a Dutch sandwich. This arrangement, used by Apple, Google, and countless other multinationals, routes profits through subsidiaries in Ireland and the Netherlands to exploit gaps in tax treaties. Intellectual property is assigned to an Irish subsidiary. Royalties are paid from high-tax countries to this subsidiary. The profits then flow through the Netherlands to another Irish company, ultimately landing in a jurisdiction with minimal taxation. Through this structure, Apple paid an effective tax rate of 0.05% on its European profits in 2014. Not 5%, not 0.5%, 0.05%. A small business owner in Ohio pays 21% federal corporate tax. Apple paid 0.05%. The system is not broken. The system is working precisely as those who wrote it intended. Every year, you receive a paycheck. Before you see it, federal income tax is withheld, Social Security tax is withheld, Medicare tax is withheld, state income tax is withheld. You receive what remains. Every year, a billionaire watches his stock portfolio appreciate. He pays nothing until he sells. If he never sells, if he instead borrows against his shares, living on loans while his assets grow untaxed, he may never pay at all. When he dies, his heirs receive the assets with a stepped-up basis, erasing the accumulated gains entirely. You work and pay. He owns and waits. This is the tax inversion. Work is punished. Wealth is rewarded. And the gap between those who labor and those who own grows wider with every paycheck. But the extraction does not end with debt, and it does not end with taxes. There is a third mechanism, silent, invisible, operating every hour of every day, that drains your purchasing power before you even understand what is being taken. On November 15, 1923, a German housewife named Anna Eisenmenger wrote in her diary, she had just returned from the market with a single loaf of bread. The price? 80 billion marks. 3 years earlier, that same loaf had cost less than 1 mark. Anna had been a prudent woman. She had saved diligently throughout her life, accumulating 60,000 marks, a comfortable sum that should have provided security in her old age. By November 1923, her life savings could not buy a postage stamp. The Weimar hyperinflation is remembered as an extreme case, a cautionary tale from a chaotic period. But the mechanism that destroyed Anna Eisenmenger's savings operates in every economy, every day, including yours. The difference is only one of speed. Inflation is not a natural phenomenon like weather. It is a policy choice. When a government spends more than it collects in taxes, it must borrow the difference. When it can no longer borrow at acceptable rates, it creates money. When money is created faster than goods and services expand, prices rise. This is inflation. And inflation is a tax. It is not called a tax. It does not appear on your pay stub. No legislator must vote for it. But it extracts wealth from you as surely as any line item on your W-2. Here is how the theft works. Imagine you earn $50,000 per year and save $5,000 of it in a bank account paying 2% interest. Now imagine inflation is running at 6%. The prices of goods and services have risen 6% over that same year. Your $500 can now purchase only what 4,811 loan could have purchased 12 months ago. You saved, you earned interest, and you lost purchasing power. This is the inflation tax. It confiscates wealth from anyone holding cash or cash equivalents, savings accounts, money market funds, certificates of deposit, bonds. The confiscation is invisible, embedded in rising prices rather than explicit deductions. And here is the crucial question. Who benefits from this confiscation? The answer is simple. Debtors benefit. When prices rise, debts shrink in real terms. A mortgage taken at $300,000 remains $300,000 nominally. But if inflation has eroded the dollar's value by half, that debt is now equivalent to $150,000 in original purchasing power. Who is the largest debtor in the United States? In the federal government. At $34 trillion in debt, the United States government benefits more from inflation than any other entity on earth. Every percentage point of inflation quietly reduces the real value of that debt. Every year of inflation transfers wealth from bondholders, the people who lent money to the government itself. This is why governments throughout history have inflated their currencies. It is the easiest tax to impose because it requires no vote. It is the most regressive tax because it falls hardest on those who save in cash, typically the poor and middle class, while benefiting those who hold assets and debt, typically the wealthy and the government. The 1970s provided Americans a vivid lesson in this mechanism. Between 1972 and 1982, cumulative inflation exceeded 130%. A dollar in 1972 was worth only 43 cents by 1982. Retirees who had saved for decades watched their purchasing power cut by more than half. A pension that provided a comfortable middle-class life in 1972 provided near poverty by 1982. Meanwhile, those who owned hard assets thrived. Housing prices rose with inflation. Stock prices, after an initial decline, recovered and exceeded previous highs. The wealthy, who held real estate and equities, preserved their wealth. The savers, who held dollars, were destroyed. This was not ancient history. This was within living memory. And it is happening again. Since 2020, the Federal Reserve has created more than $4 trillion in new money. Official inflation, measured by the Consumer Price Index, peaked at 9.1% in June 2022, the highest in 4 decades. But official inflation systematically understates the prices most people actually pay. The CPI uses techniques like hedonic adjustment and substitution to minimize reported inflation. If the price of beef rises, the index assumes you substitute chicken. If computers become more powerful, the index assumes you are paying less per unit of computing power even if the sticker price remains constant. Through these adjustments, official inflation consistently runs below the inflation experienced by households buying groceries, paying rent, and filling gas tanks. Independent analyses suggest true inflation, the actual increase in cost of living for average Americans, has exceeded official figures by 2 to 4 percentage points annually. If official inflation is 4%, Real inflation may be 6 to 8%. Your savings are eroding faster than the government admits. Consider what this means for retirement. Traditional financial advice assumed you could save money, invest conservatively in bonds and bank accounts, and retire on the accumulated sum. This advice was designed for a world of stable money. That world no longer exists. Today, a retiree who keeps savings in a bank account earning 4%, while true inflation runs at 7%, loses 3% of purchasing power every year. Over a 20-year retirement, nearly half their savings evaporates. Not through spending, but through silent confiscation. The system has made conservative saving a guaranteed path to impoverishment. You are now forced to take risks simply to preserve what you have. You must buy stocks, real estate, or other volatile assets not to grow wealth, but merely to avoid losing it. The casino is no longer optional. If you refuse to gamble, inflation will take your chips anyway. This is precisely what the architects of the system intended. In Hungary, 1946, inflation reached rates that make Weimar look modest. At its peak, prices doubled every 15 hours. The Hungarian pengo became so worthless that the government issued the 100 quintillion pengo note, the highest denomination banknote ever printed. It was worth approximately 10 cents American. In Argentina, 2001, the government froze bank accounts in a measure called the corralito. Citizens could not withdraw their own money. When the freeze lifted, the peso had been devalued by 75%. Savings accumulated over decades vanished in weeks. These are not aberrations. They are the logical endpoints of a system that funds government through money creation rather than taxation. The United States has not reached these endpoints yet, but the trajectory is identical. The difference is pace, not direction. Every dollar you save is a target. Every year you hold it, inflation extracts its toll. The Federal Reserve calls this price stability, a 2% annual target that sounds modest until you calculate the cumulative effect. At 2% annual inflation, a dollar loses half its value in 35 years. At 4% in 18 years. At 7% in 10 years. Your money is melting, slowly enough that you do not notice, quickly enough that it matters. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of the trap is not the debt, the taxes, or the inflation. It is what happens inside your mind, the psychological architecture that convinces you the trap is your own fault. In 1929, a man named Edward Bernays stood on a sidewalk in New York City and watched a parade of young women march down Fifth Avenue, cigarettes held aloft like torches. The press called them torches of freedom. The public called it a feminist statement. Almost no one knew that Bernays had staged the entire event. The American Tobacco Company had a problem. Half the population, women, considered smoking unladylike. This was not a health concern. It was a revenue concern. Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud and the father of modern public relations, was hired to solve it. He did not advertise cigarettes to women. Advertising would be too obvious, too resistible. Instead, he manufactured a cultural moment. He paid fashionable debutantes to light cigarettes during the Easter parade. He tipped off photographers. He framed smoking as rebellion against patriarchal oppression. Within a decade, the taboo had evaporated. Women smoked in public. American tobacco's revenue soared. And almost no one understood they had been manipulated. Bernays wrote openly about his methods. His 1928 book, Propaganda, declared, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government which is the true ruling power." He was not ashamed. He was proud. He had discovered that human beings do not make rational decisions. They make emotional decisions and rationalize them afterward. Control the emotions and you control the behavior. This discovery was not confined to selling cigarettes. It became the operating system of consumer capitalism. In 1899, an economist named Thorstein Veblen published The Theory of the Leisure Class. In it, he introduced a concept that would define the next century: conspicuous consumption. Veblen observed that wealthy people did not buy expensive things because those things were functionally superior. They bought them to signal status. A gold watch tells time no better than a steel one, but it tells everyone who sees it that the wearer is successful. Veblen saw this as pathology. The consumer economy saw it as opportunity. If people buy things to signal status rather than for utility, then you do not need to make better products. You need to make products that signal higher status. And if you can manipulate what signals status, you can manufacture unlimited demand. This is why your phone costs $1,200 when a $300 phone performs identically. This is why your car costs $45,000 when a $25,000 car transports you just as effectively. This is why your handbag costs $2,000 when a $50 bag holds the same items. You are not buying function, you are buying status. And the system has convinced you that your worth as a human being is measured by your status purchases. Consider what this means psychologically. If your value depends on what you consume, then your value depends on your income. If your income is insufficient to consume what the system tells you represents success, then you are insufficient. Not the system. You. The debt you carry to afford status goods is not evidence of a predatory system. It is evidence of your failure to earn enough. The savings you lack are not evidence of stagnant wages. They are evidence of your failure to budget properly. The retirement you cannot afford is not evidence of inflation and extraction. It is evidence of your failure to plan. Every systemic failure is reframed as personal failure. This is the psychological prison. The bars are not made of steel. They are made of shame. In the Soviet Union, the state used propaganda differently, but toward identical ends. When collective farms failed to meet quotas, the state did not blame the system of collectivization. It blamed saboteurs, wreckers, enemies of the people. Workers who complained were not identifying systemic problems. They were revealing counter-revolutionary attitudes. The Soviet citizen learned to internalize failure. If the system was perfect, then any problem must originate in the individual. This created a population that policed itself, that felt guilty for systemic failures, that never questioned the architecture of their captivity. American capitalism achieved the same outcome through different means. Instead of overt propaganda, it uses advertising. $300 billion per year in the United States alone, relentlessly associating products with happiness, success, love, and belonging. Instead of collective punishment, it uses credit scores. Numerical ratings that quantify your worthiness, that determine your access to housing, employment, and opportunity. Instead of secret police, it uses social media. Platforms algorithmically designed to maximize engagement by triggering envy, inadequacy, and fear. The result is a population that blames itself. 63% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. They do not organize. They do not protest. They feel ashamed. They assume their neighbors are doing better. They wonder what is wrong with them. 44% of Americans cannot cover a $1,000 emergency expense. They do not question why wages have stagnated for 50 years. They question their own spending habits. They download budgeting apps. They cut small luxuries. They never examine the system that ensures their labor generates wealth for others. The average American sees over 5,000 advertisements per day. Each one whispers the same message. You are not enough. You do not have enough. Buy this and you will be complete. The message is so constant, so pervasive, that it becomes invisible. It becomes the air you breathe. And when you cannot afford what the advertisements promise, when you carry debt to approximate the life they display, when you feel perpetually behind despite working constantly, you do not blame the advertisements. You do not blame the system. You blame yourself. This is the genius of the psychological prison. The inmates guard themselves. Bernays understood this in 1929. Veblen understood it in 1899. The architects of the consumer economy have understood it for over a century. Human beings can be made to desire what harms them. Human beings can be made to blame themselves for systemic predation. Human beings can be made to defend the very structures that imprison them. You are not bad with money. You are operating within a system designed to ensure that you never accumulate wealth. You are not failing to keep up. You are running on a treadmill engineered to accelerate faster than any human can sprint. You are not inadequate. You are being harvested. But the psychological prison does not only affect individuals, it affects entire societies. When a population blames itself for systemic failure, it does not demand systemic change. It does not organize. It does not revolt. Until one day, it does. Because there is a pattern that repeats throughout history. A pattern that emerges when the middle class is sufficiently hollowed. When enough people realize the game is rigged. When the shame transforms into rage. And that pattern should terrify anyone paying attention. On July 14th, 1789, a Parisian mob stormed the Bastille. The fortress held only 7 prisoners, 4 forgers, 2 lunatics, and 1 aristocrat, imprisoned at his family's request. It was a symbolic target, not a strategic one. But symbols matter when a society is fracturing. What most histories omit is who comprised that mob. They were not the poorest of France. The truly destitute were too hungry to revolt, too focused on survival to organize. The men who tore down the Bastille were craftsmen, shopkeepers, small merchants, the middle class of Paris. They were literate, they had trades, they had expected reasonably that their skills and labor would provide a decent life. The system had promised them that. The system had lied. In the decades before the revolution, France experienced what economists would later recognize as a classic squeeze. Prices rose faster than wages. The cost of bread, the staple of French diet, tripled between 1760 and 1789. Meanwhile, the aristocracy and clergy paid virtually no taxes. The burden fell on the third estate. The commoners, the workers, the middle class. A lawyer could no longer afford what his father had afforded. A merchant watched his purchasing power evaporate. An artisan who had trained for years found his skills worth less with each passing season. These were not people who wanted revolution. They wanted what they had been promised: stability, modest prosperity, a future for their children. When they realized the promise was void, when they understood that the rules they had followed were designed to benefit others, their disappointment curdled into fury. The revolution that followed killed approximately 40,000 people during the Terror alone. It devoured its own leaders, Danton, Robespierre, Hébert, with mechanical efficiency. It produced not liberty, equality, and fraternity, but Napoleon, empire, and 2 decades of continental war. The middle class that began the revolution did not benefit from it. They merely provided its fuel. 128 years later, the pattern repeated. In February 1917, bread lines formed in Petrograd. Russia was losing the war against Germany. The Tsar's government had proven spectacularly incompetent. Inflation had eroded wages to meaninglessness. The middle class, teachers, engineers, clerks, minor officials, found themselves unable to afford basic necessities. The first protests were not led by Bolsheviks. They were led by women demanding bread. The strikes that followed drew not from the lumpen proletariat, but from skilled workers, the labor aristocracy, people who had expected their competence to be rewarded. When the soldiers refused to fire on the crowds, the Tsar abdicated. When the provisional government failed to end the war or feed the cities, the Bolsheviks seized power. What followed was civil war, famine, terror, and 70 years of totalitarian rule. The middle class that enabled the revolution was systematically liquidated by it. 42 years later in Cuba, the pattern emerged again. Fulgencio Batista ran a corrupt regime that served American business interests and a small Cuban elite. But Cuba was not impoverished by Caribbean standards. It had a substantial middle class. Doctors, lawyers, teachers, small business owners. Havana was prosperous. The statistics looked acceptable. What the statistics missed was the distribution. The middle class was stagnating while connected elites accumulated obscene wealth. Education no longer guaranteed advancement. Hard work no longer produced security. The professional class watched their children's futures narrow. Fidel Castro was not a peasant. He was a lawyer from a land-owning family. Che Guevara was a physician. The early revolutionary movement drew heavily from the educated middle class. People who had followed the rules and discovered the rules were rigged. Castro promised reform. He delivered totalitarianism. The middle class that supported his revolution fled to Miami or faced imprisonment. The pattern held. 3 revolutions, 3 centuries, 3 continents. The mechanism was identical. Revolutions do not begin with the desperate. The desperate are too busy surviving. Revolutions begin when the middle class, the educated, the skilled, the people who believed in the system, lose faith. When a lawyer cannot afford what his father afforded. When an engineer watches his savings evaporate. When a teacher realizes her children will live worse than she did. These people do not want revolution. They want the promise to be kept. When they finally accept that it will not be, that the rules were never meant to benefit them, their disillusionment becomes combustible. Now consider the United States in 2024. The statistics are familiar because they have been cited so often. They have lost their power to shock. But examine them again, slowly, and feel their weight. 63% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. This includes households earning over $100,000 annually. The middle class, by any definition, is not saving. It is surviving. 44% of Americans cannot cover a $400 emergency expense without borrowing or selling something. $400. A car repair, a medical bill, a broken appliance. Nearly half the country would be destabilized by an expense that would have been trivial a generation ago. The median home price in the United States now exceeds $400,000. The median household income is approximately $75,000. By traditional lending standards, a home should cost no more than 3 times annual income. The median family can afford a $225,000 home. The median home costs nearly twice what the median family can afford. In 1970, a median income household could purchase a median-priced home. In 2024, this is mathematically impossible without extraordinary assistance or extraordinary debt. Student loan debt exceeds $1.77 trillion, and the medical debt affects 100 million Americans. Credit card debt has surpassed $1 trillion. The middle class is not building wealth. It is servicing obligations. And the distribution grows more extreme each year. In 1980, the top 1% of Americans controlled 10% of national wealth. Today, they control over 32%. The top 0.1%, approximately 130,000 households, own more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. This concentration exceeds the Gilded Age. It exceeds the 1920s. It exceeds pre-revolutionary France. The Spanish Empire provides a longer-term lesson. Between 1557 and 1647, Spain declared bankruptcy 6 times. Gold and silver flowed from the Americas, but it flowed through Spain rather than into it. The crown spent on wars, on palaces, on maintaining an empire too large to sustain. The middle class, merchants, craftsmen, professionals, was taxed relentlessly while the aristocracy and church enjoyed exemptions. Skilled workers emigrated to the colonies or to other European nations. Commerce declined. Innovation ceased. Spain, which had been the dominant power in Europe, began a decline from which it never recovered. The empire did not collapse dramatically. It hollowed out over generations. The middle class that should have driven economic vitality was extracted to exhaustion. What remained was a shell, aristocrats who owned everything, peasants who owned nothing, and a memory of former greatness. This is what the hollowing looks like from inside. It feels like personal failure. It feels like you are not working hard enough, not smart enough, not disciplined enough. It feels like everyone else is managing while you struggle. The system encourages this feeling. It depends on it. But the numbers tell a different story. The numbers say the middle class is being liquidated, not through revolution, not through war, through systematic extraction, debt, taxes, inflation, psychological manipulation, until nothing remains but the very rich and everyone else. The question is not whether this is happening. The question is what comes next, because history suggests that when the hollowing is complete, when the middle class finally stops blaming itself and starts blaming the system, the result is not reform. The result is fire. In 1897, the British Empire controlled approximately 25% of the world's land surface and ruled over 400 million people. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. The Royal Navy dominated every ocean. British banks financed projects on every continent. To be born British was to be born into the most powerful civilization in human history. 50 years later, Britain was bankrupt. The empire did not collapse through military defeat. Germany and Japan were crushed. Britain stood among the victors. But victory had cost everything. The war debt was staggering, over 200% of GDP. The colonies, which had once generated wealth, now demanded independence. The industries that had made Britain the workshop of the world were obsolete, bombed, or outcompeted. In 1956, Britain attempted to reassert imperial power during the Suez Crisis. The United States, now holding the world's reserve currency, forced Britain to withdraw by threatening to crash the pound. The humiliation was complete. Britain was no longer a great power. It was a client state with memories. What happened to British citizens during this decline? They experienced precisely what the paycheck trap produces. Wages stagnated. Prices rose. The post-war rationing continued until 1954, 9 years after victory. Housing was scarce. Opportunities narrowed. A generation that had sacrificed everything for their nation discovered their nation had nothing left to give them. The middle class that had built the empire was liquidated by its decline. This is what the end stage looks like. Not dramatic collapse, not sudden catastrophe. A slow grinding down, generation by generation, until the children of prosperity inherit only the debts of their ancestors. And here is the truth that no financial advisor will tell you, that no self-help book will acknowledge, that the entire apparatus of personal finance exists to obscure. You cannot escape the trap through individual action. You can optimize your budget, you can eliminate lattes and avocado toast. You can negotiate your salary and maximize your 401k contributions. You can read every book on financial literacy and follow every piece of advice, and the system will still extract from you, because the trap is not a consequence of your choices. It is the architecture within which your choices occur. You are not playing the game poorly. The game is designed so that most players lose. Consider the mathematics one final time. Productivity has risen 64% since 1979. Wages have risen 17%. The difference, 47 percentage points of productivity growth, has flowed to capital owners. No amount of personal financial optimization can recapture that extraction. It is removed before you ever see it. The Cantillon effect ensures that new money reaches asset owners before workers. By the time wages rise, prices have already absorbed the new money. No budgeting app can overcome this timing disadvantage. It is structural. The debt system transforms your future labor into present assets for creditors. Student loans, mortgages, credit cards, each converts your tomorrow into their today. You can minimize debt, but you cannot eliminate the system that makes debt necessary for housing, education, and medical care. The tax code extracts more from labor than from capital. You can maximize deductions, but you cannot access the carried interest loophole. You cannot create offshore structures. The advantages are reserved for those who already have wealth. Inflation erodes your savings faster than safe investments can grow them. You can invest in the stock market, but you are then exposed to volatility, crashes, and the superior information of institutional investors. You are gambling at a table where the house has already seen the cards. The wealthy understand this. They do not escape the system through frugality. They escape it through ownership. When a billionaire needs money, he does not sell assets. Selling triggers capital gains tax. Instead, he borrows against his assets. The loan is not income. It is not taxed. The interest on the loan is often tax deductible. He lives on borrowed money while his assets appreciate untaxed. When he dies, his heirs receive the assets with a stepped-up basis, erasing the accumulated gains. The taxes are never paid. This is not a loophole. This is the system working as designed. In 1907, when financial panic threatened to collapse the American banking system, J.P. Morgan did not wait for the government to act. He summoned the leading bankers to his private library, locked the doors, and forced them to pledge their own capital to stop the crisis. Morgan personally decided which institutions would survive and which would fail. He was not elected. He was not appointed. He simply had enough power to determine the fate of millions. The crisis passed. Morgan was hailed as a savior. And within 6 years, the Federal Reserve was created, a central bank designed by Morgan's associates on Jekyll Island, in secret, to institutionalize the power Morgan had wielded personally. The system does not exist to serve you. It exists to serve those who designed it. The Rothschild banking dynasty understood this in the 19th century. They financed governments on every side of European wars, collecting interest regardless of who won. They did not care about nations. They cared about debt. Every war increased debt, every debt paid interest. The Rothschilds did not need to win wars, they only needed wars to be fought. This is the logic of the system. It does not need you to prosper. It needs you to participate. It needs you to work, to earn, to borrow, to pay interest. Whether you thrive or merely survive is irrelevant. What matters is that you remain in the system, generating the flows of wealth that sustain those at the top. So what happens next? History suggests two possibilities. The first is managed decline. The middle class continues to erode. Each generation is poorer than the last. Expectations adjust downward. People learn to want less, to accept less, to blame themselves for having less. The extraction continues indefinitely at a pace slow enough to prevent organized resistance. This is the British model. Not collapse, but diminishment. Not catastrophe, but quiet desperation stretching across decades. The second is rupture. The hollowing continues until it cannot. A shock, economic, political, environmental, reveals the fragility beneath the surface. The middle class, finally understanding that the rules were never meant to benefit them, stops playing by those rules. What follows is unpredictable but historically consistent. Upheaval, violence, the destruction of existing institutions, and the emergence of something new. The something new is rarely better. France got Napoleon. Russia got Stalin. Cuba got Castro. The middle class that enables revolution is typically consumed by it. The architects of the old system are replaced by new architects who build new systems of extraction. This is not pessimism. This is pattern recognition. This is what the historical record shows repeatedly across centuries and continents. The paycheck trap exists because it benefits those who designed it. It will continue to exist as long as they retain the power to maintain it. Individual escape is possible for a few, but systemic escape requires systemic change. And systemic change, historically, comes at a price most people are unwilling to pay until they have no other choice. You are living in Pullman, Illinois. The boundaries are invisible, but they are real. You earn wages that flow back to the system through debt, taxes, inflation, and consumption. At the end of each month, after all the extractions, you have just enough to continue and not enough to escape. This is not an accident. This is not a failure of the system. This is the system succeeding. George Pullman died in 1897. He was so hated by his former workers that his family feared his body would be desecrated. They buried him at night in a lead-lined coffin, encased in concrete, beneath a forest of railroad ties. It took 2 days to make his grave secure. The workers who had lived in his town, who had owed their souls to his company store, eventually won the right to live elsewhere, to spend their wages freely, to escape the company town. But they did not escape the model. The model simply expanded. It became invisible. It became normal. You are not in debt because you failed. You are in debt because the system requires your debt. You are not falling behind because you lack discipline. You are falling behind because the treadmill accelerates faster than any human can run. You are not failing to build wealth because you are foolish. You are failing to build wealth because your wealth is being extracted, systematically, legally, continuously. The paycheck trap is not broken. It is functioning exactly as designed. The only question that remains is the one that has echoed through every hollowed out empire, every revolution, every collapse. How long can a system that serves so few continue to demand the compliance of so many? History has answered that question before, and history suggests we may be closer to the answer than anyone wants to believe.